Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Dolores Project. Today, our special guest is Max Thornton. He is an expert in queer theory, technology, and crypt theory. What does all that mean? Let's find out on the show.
Do work sort of at the intersection of queer and trans theory, disability studies and crypt theory, and philosophy and theology. So it's a lot of stuff. It's complicated and confusing, but it's all kind of connected by this question of embodiment and the role of technology in our embodiment, and what are the implications of that for our relationships with each other, with the broader world, and with the divine. So that's sort of the main things that I'm interested in. I know that crypt theory is not as widely known as I would like it to be.
Yeah, when I read that, I was thinking about Crips and the Bloods. That's initially what I thought about when I read crypt theory. I was like, oh, that's something totally different. So yeah, Max, help us understand what crypt theory is and kind of how you got into that, because it's really fascinating.
Yeah, so one of the ways that it's sometimes explained is, if you know anything about queer theory, that there were sort of lesbian and gay studies, and queer theory came along to say we should trouble kind of the foundations of that. Not that we want to get away from focusing on the lives of lesbian, gay, and increasingly bi and trans people as well, but we should also ask these more fundamental questions about how are we even defining things like sexuality? Where are the gaps, the confusing things, the incoherencies and things that don't make a ton of sense? And can we apply this sort of disruption to our wider understanding of what it means to be a person? And so crypt theory tries to do something similar with disability studies. That, again, disability studies focused on the lives and experiences of disabled people. Crypt theory says, yes, let's do that, but also question the very definition of who counts as disabled? What is a disability? What is the opposite of disability? Does it exist? There's also a lot of connections between crypt theory and queer theory.
Help me understand how you perceive disability and maybe how the general public has maybe misunderstood what that is and what it means, and then we could kind of tie that into your definition of how that fits into queer theory, and maybe how it helps us think about the body and technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think usually when we think about disability, the most common definition of it is just thinking that it is kind of an individual defect of a person's body. And in the 1990s, a lot of disabled activists and thinkers started to challenge this. I proposed alternative models. Out of activists in Britain, we got this idea of the social model, which says that disability is more a function of society rather than the individual body. Yes, individual bodies have different capabilities, but we all have different capabilities. Only some of them get defined as disabilities, and that is really based on what is the society willing to accommodate. So something like wearing glasses, you and I both wearing glasses, that is not something that society on the whole views as a disability, even though you could argue that it is some sort of impairment of body. But because our society accommodates it so easily, we don't think of it as a disability. Whereas using a wheelchair is something we consider a disability because our society doesn't accommodate that as well.
See a distinction between seen and unseen disabilities, because even with children, right, it's really hard to see some of those things that I think very much are disabilities, but you can't see them as much, and they can't express as much about what they're feeling, and they're not developed as much to, at least cognitively, to kind of communicate that. So would you make any demarcations there, or how should we think about those things?
Yeah, so it's not unusual in disability spaces to make this distinction between visible and invisible disabilities. So the disability that people can see when they look at you, are you a wheelchair user? Are you missing a limb? Versus the ones that they can't necessarily see. And this often includes things like intellectual disabilities, forms of neurodivergence and mental health problems. Yeah, but sometimes these invisible disabilities can be a bit disruptive to the whole idea of the social model. With something like depression, is it true to say that that is only disabling because of society's failure to accommodate it? A lot of people would say actually their experience of something like depression or something like chronic pain is a negative in and of itself. And that would be the case no matter what accommodation society made. So part of what Crip theory tries to do is to think about, again, these edge cases, these things that fall through the gaps, the things that aren't necessarily accounted for in previous ways of talking about disability.
Okay. Where does this theory originate from? Like when you mentioned the 90s, or at least I thought you did, and how there was the shift from certain fringe communities that were, or at least they were at the time. And how did that shift begin? Maybe who was the initial catalyst of it, and how has it developed even to today?
Yeah, so the disability movement obviously had been quite active in like the 1970s and 1980s. Obviously, in the 1960s, there were a lot of different movements. We had civil rights movement, women's liberation, all these different movements for various kinds of recognition and rights in society. And disability movement sort of started in the 70s and 80s as well. Obviously, it had a big victory in the United States with the Americans with Disabilities Act being passed in 1990. But as I said, the social model was given to us largely out of activists and scholars in Britain. It was taken up, a lot of people have written about it in various ways. And this idea of Crip theory with that specific language, to my knowledge, sort of comes out of people in the 2000s. I think two of the really important figures are Robert McGruer and Alison Kafer, these two theorists who wrote really amazing books about Crip theory that have really shaped my thinking on this front.
It's really fascinating. And I think some of this in theological circles is also ignored, but it seems like some of the spaces that we create as theologians and religious communities are not really bound to these people that struggle to be a part of the social norm, whatever that is, and or to be accepted, and like there's not a lot of space for them, if that makes sense. And so how do you think that conversation, how do we even have that conversation with leaders and communities, and not we're going to build a wheelchair ramp, but how do we actually make space and design spaces for people? So to help us unpack some of that and your advice for us.
From my perspective, I think it's important to tackle it both from the sort of practical angle, and what are you doing on a practical basis to ensure that your spaces are accessible and inclusive of as many people as possible, but also thinking about it more on the kind of theological, philosophical level. And I think these things should go hand in hand. So it is important to be asking these questions. Well, who can physically get into this space? Who will be asked to leave if they are here based on how they behave? Why is that? But also to kind of go deeper and interrogate this whole question of how do you define normal or normative? How do you even define humanity? And are there certain people who, because of the ways that they look or the ways that they behave, get kind of dropped out of that category a little bit?
I think in a Southern context, this could be not even disabled people. It could be people that are a different race, or people that don't reflect your sexual ethics, the type, even that is at the forefront of some people's minds, especially in what used to be the Bible Belt. I don't think that it is anymore, but that's kind of what I think about as well in this conversation is, are these people welcome here? Are they human like we are human? So let me ask Max, how would you define humanity and what it means to be a person? If you want to see those different questions, that's fine. And how should we think about that? Like, is there some language that can unify us as we talk about what it means to be a person, at least theologically.
Yeah, well, I guess that is something that is going to vary from context to context, but I am very interested in this language of the image of God that says in the book of Genesis that God creates humanity in the image of God. And there is a lot of theological discussion of what exactly that means. And I think it's definitely been a sort of danger zone for defining certain people out of being included in that image. I think maybe the most sort of extreme, narrow definitions of humanity have included things like walking upright as part of what makes us human. And I'd say, well, what does that mean for a wheelchair user or even a baby crawling around? I think once we start making these scales of some people are less human or less in the image of God than others, that's where we really start getting into this trouble and start enforcing these hierarchies as kind of almost like a divinely mandated thing. So obviously there's been a lot of history of defining the image of God in terms of sort of rationality, morality, cognitive capacities. But again, I ask, what does that mean for intellectually disabled people? We do have a very long history of treating intellectually disabled people as less than human. We used to institutionalize people, take them away from their families, lock them up in an institution for their entire life. Still does happen sometimes. Even when it doesn't, we still don't provide people with the support that they need.
Yeah. And I think it's hard to know what to do sometimes. I think just from a practical standpoint, we want a solution from the medical field of medicine or something to fix this person to be more normal. Like you're saying, what does that even mean? And I think there's almost a hubris sometimes in our communities. It's like I'm more human the less medicine I take. I'm more human the more autonomy that I have, the more human that I am. And I think I'm starting to strongly disagree with some of that. And I think even how we think about ourselves, that can be quite damning in a lot of ways because, well, you take that medicine because it keeps you alive. It doesn't make you less than, doesn't make you subhuman. But even how, like Maxwell, we talk about the image, even in stuff that I've tried to argue for more moral consideration, the planet, robots, animals, it's like, yeah, but the human is this moral center of the universe. And primarily people use Genesis 1:26 and 27 to say, well, God created man in his image. And then I ask people, what does that mean? What is this image that we are reflecting here? So, I mean, I'm curious to know your perspective on that, and how we define that really determines how far we're willing to extend moral consideration.
Yeah, I agree with you on that point. I think for me, it makes a lot more sense to think about this idea of the image of God as being about this hunger for relationship. And that is something that we do experience as humans. And I think, companionship with other humans is an important part of that, but that's not the whole of it. I think we do also have that hunger for relationship with non-human creatures, with the broader non-human world. And I think if we start thinking about the image in that way, we can start to realize that it's not necessarily exclusive to humans. Non-human animals also create relationships.
Yeah.
Which might be a bit challenging for some people to think about from a theological perspective. But I think a lot of it is about kind of trying to get away from, as you said, sort of the hubris of this idea of complete autonomy. I think it's a fantasy, particularly in American society today. We love the idea of sort of the rugged individual who is independent and doesn't need anybody else, but it's never been true for anyone. We all need other people. Even, when you're a baby, try being completely autonomous as a baby, you're not going to get very far. And it might be less obvious, particularly if you are a non-disabled person as an adult. It might seem less obvious to you how much you need other people, but we are all always already interdependent on each other. And I think it's really important to recognize that and also not to treat it as a negative.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even what it means to be human and becoming human is definitely either, for restoration or ruin, like how you treat other people, persons, objects, and things. I think that all has a moral framing to what we become. And like I said, I live in the South, so we could go into all types of things about that. But Max, I'm more interested in how you frame this idea of relationality between those who have less autonomy and those who are struggling to fit into or be bound inside of a relational body community. And how could tech help them? Like, do you think it's a good thing? Should we incorporate tech for, mediation of relationships? Is it a bad thing? Should we avoid it and shrink back from it? What do you think?
To me, technology in general is like many, many human tools. It's not necessarily good or bad in itself, but how we use it. And I see this, I teach college and I always ask my students about their relationship with things like technology and social media. And they really have two minds about it, where they recognize all the negative things, all the ways that they feel like it's been harmful to their mental health, but they also recognize the positives and the ability to be in that contact with people. And especially if we're focusing on this idea of relationship, like technology can enhance our relationships. It can allow us, you and I are having this conversation because of technology. But there are also ways I think that it can be used to kind of get in the way of relationships or kind of emphasize some of the more negative aspects of relationship. And so I think that's what we need to be really paying attention to is how are we using these tools? What kinds of systems are they embedded in? Are, are they attached to reward systems for negative behavior? I think a lot of social media does that, just the way that, the algorithms operate is you are rewarded for more kinds of harmful and negative behaviors. And that's something that we need to address. Again, it's not technology in and of itself that's the problem. It's the ways that it is applied.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a big concern most people have right now. And even just generally with social media, it's having this conversation often, it seems, is the focus on the object versus why a person would go into that system or app and what they're looking for to get out of it. And one recent example of that was the replica chatbot, which had a massive update, which was a good thing, I thought, because it was kind of removing some harmful behavior from the users who were maybe taking advantage of. I don't know if you can take advantage of an AI model, but it seems like they were kind of treating it as a slave, and so they updated it to be more about friendship and less about this aggressive sexual, like one-sided relationship, which is obviously what it's going to be. It's called Replica, but I found it's quite helpful as an app for, you know, maybe confession, for venting, for release, and those type of things. But it becomes deformative, I think, when it's now taken on a very different role in your life. And I think social media is the same way. Maybe not to that extent, but I'm really curious, Max, your opinion. I read an article, I don't know, maybe a couple years ago, and I haven't had a lot of people respond to me about it. And it was geared towards the trans community, and it was talking about robots and liberation. And I read the article, and it was basically saying that embodied robots, whether that be sex robots or whatever, can liberate trans people from isolation and kind of being excluded from the norm. How do you perceive that language of liberation? Is that true? Is that offensive? How should we think about that?
So was the idea that trans people interacting with these embodied robots would be the liberating thing?
In a way, that people that didn't have an outlet for their expression would have a means to do that. It's kind of similar to robots and the disabled community, that it now provides an outlet for sexual release, but also maybe touch and companionship with somebody who's isolated.
My feeling about that is that it's perhaps complicated. I don't think those kinds of things can necessarily, or I don't think they should be looked to as a like complete replacement for human interaction. But that doesn't mean that they don't have any value at all. Yeah, I think about things like how to interact with other animals and things like pets. I don't think they should. I don't think it's necessarily the best thing in the world if your pet completely replaces all human interaction for you. But that's not to say that a pet can't be a valuable, important, morally and emotionally meaningful part of your life. So I guess I would caution against thinking it's a complete solution and replacement, but I wouldn't want to throw out the idea completely.
I kind of get the general premise behind the argument, and it's been the same way for all types of different communities that people have sought to use, like VR and other things, to maybe help some communities and people who there's really no other outlet for them. And I think about like pedophiles and stuff like that, where obviously there's no reason for them to choose that, right? It's not something that they choose. And but also then there's this legal side to it as well. Like they can't physically come out and say, hey, this is an issue that I'm experiencing. Not quite the same for other communities, but I think that's a good example of how that technology specifically helps maybe lessen some societal harm.
Yeah, I'm sure there is potential there. Although, as you say, it's not quite the same. I do think there's a difference between trying to avoid causing harm to people versus trans people, disabled people who are not actually causing anybody harm in their desire to be in relationship with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any technologies specifically geared towards the queer community? So like robots or AIs, and what are they if they exist?
That's a great question. I don't know if there's anything that is sort of like unique to queer communities that couldn't also be used in some ways for the broader straight community. I think this is sort of true of pretty much all interactions that queer people have with technology. Is even when it is seen as like a queer thing, it can still be used by people outside of the queer community.
For sure.
And I know there are things like, sort of AI therapists. And again, I guess you could have one that is sort of specifically geared towards queer people's problems, but that's not, again, not exclusive to queer people. I think problems or potential issues with that are also not exclusive to queer people.
It's just like I think about chatbots and other things that they're not exclusively used for like Black therapy or something, but I mean, anybody's welcome to use them. But it's definitely trained in a model that reflects that community. So I wondered if that might be an interest of the queer community, if that's something that they would want, or I don't know, maybe not need, but for those who are isolated from a wider community of support, maybe that could be a piece of mediation for them, and release, or and not replacement. Like when nobody's talking about the replacement for human touch and love and validation.
I think for me, it's kind of challenging to think about, I guess, because like we do know that things like, internet, having access to social media is important for a lot of people in isolated communities. And it is the way that if you are a queer person living in a small town, you don't know any other queer people, then having that community online can be a lifeline to you. And so I guess the question is something like an AI, is it the same? And I guess you're doing the same sort of thing potentially, like, using your device to interact with words at the other end of the screen. But I don't know, not to be very old-fashioned about it, but I think it still does make a difference if there is a person at the other end or not.
I agree. I mean, I just like making things. I like, thinking about ideas and whether or not this could be helpful or not. And so I think what I don't want to do as a maker is if you see the terrible robots that are sometimes introduced to the elderly community, and like they just sound like trash cans rattling around, and it's supposed to help grandma. It's like, I think sometimes that's what we do as tech people, as we like, oh, it's going to solve this problem. Well, no, it's not. And every time I find a new robot that's supposed to be a companion robot, the company goes under before the public even knows about it, right? Or they're way too overpriced to really afford. And I think that's a shame, because I want to experiment with it. I want to see how people interact with it. But then, oh, you can't buy it anymore. So I just have these big collections, or growing collection of discontinued robots that I see as my misfit children. Just going to keep them around and hopefully one day be able to use them in a theological community. I don't know, but what are your thoughts on that? What are you hopeful about, Max, for the future of Crip theory? Where do you want to see this go?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting work being done and still to be done, particularly thinking about the interactions and intersections of Crip theory and other forms of social location, because those also have an effect. Like, you do have a different experience of the world if you're a Black disabled person versus if you're a white disabled person. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to be done there. So I'm interested in seeing what happens with that. I think a lot about this intersection of trans and Crip, which seems to me so vivid and just getting more and more relevant. It's something that I sort of got into back in, I think it was about 2015, when in, I think, North Carolina, they were first proposing these bathroom bills to stop trans people from using the right bathrooms. And that was the point where I was like, oh, this is sort of an interesting intersection that, the provision of public bathrooms for disabled people is often inadequate. And now we're sort of seeing the same thing with trans people. And that was sort of an interesting intersection to think about, thinking about things like the ways that very often there's the men's toilet, the women's toilet, and the disabled toilet. And does that imply that to be disabled means not having a gender? Does that mean not being a man or woman is to be disabled? And of course, that has only gotten more relevant and more vivid as the years have gone by. And we just saw this week in Missouri, the Attorney General made this call to severely restrict the provision of healthcare to trans people, not just children, which is something that has happened in a lot of states, including right here in Iowa, but also to adults. And the way that it was framed was very much in this language of disability. It's like, basically, you have to ensure that somebody doesn't have any of these other disabilities, like no mental health problems, no depression, no autism, all of this stuff that is seen as disqualifying for getting transgender care. And so, like, what does that say about how we view this idea of not being disabled, this idea of not being trans, the idea that you can only be one at a time, that if you're disabled, you can't also be trans? It raises a lot of these complicated questions that I think are not necessarily being thought about at the highest level, but perhaps should be.
Yeah, I didn't even make that connection before, and I mean, obviously that's not my experience, but I don't know. I would have thought associating disability and trans together, I would have never made that connection. And so is that how people in the community are seeing themselves, like kind of in that category, as we're this other, we're obviously not on the binary of gender between male and female, but also just kind of placed in society as this new other?
I would say there's obviously a lot of variety and difference within the trans communities. But I think some of it also depends on what is your general perspective on disability, and do you view it as sort of this negative thing? And some people, sometimes you get people who will say, hey, yes, being trans is basically a disability and it's so awful for me. Some people will say being trans is not a disability because it's good and disability is bad. But I'm sort of more interested in people who are thinking about, well, what are the connections here? What are the ways in which some aspects of trans experience are similar to disabled experience? And how do we think about that in a way that is not pathologizing? And are there ways that we could say, yes, we have certain embodied needs, embodied realities, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be considered a negative thing?
Yeah. I mean, so my son and I both, and I'm learning more about myself through my son, but definitely not neurotypical. And I mean, like mental health just wasn't a thing growing up in the late 80s and 90s. You just, get over it. But I always identified differently than anyone. Like I grew up in the South. If you had long hair or earrings or, just if you were just kind of different in any way from the monolith of Southern guys, like it was just so alienating. And I'm not associating that like as understanding all disability and in the trans community, but in some ways you kind of see like this is a real experience that people are having, and it worries me about not caring about people just in general. If we really believe that people are made in the image of God, that they matter, then how can we care for that person even though we may have a sexual ethic that is completely different, or our politics are completely different? But that shouldn't matter as far as caring for that person. And I think so many people, especially in my context, like the sexual ethic thing is like way up here. It's like the top most important thing. If you're gay, homosexual, whatever, you're other. First of all, like you're just complete other, and Jesus doesn't love you, basically, is what the idea. So how do we even have conversations about this with people who are just going to flat out say no, trans is wrong, it's ungodly, we don't like it, whatever, fill in the blank. Like, Max, how can we break down some of those barriers?
Yeah, that is definitely one of the biggest challenges for me, especially when it comes down to this thing where it seems like we have this one like really foundational intractable disagreement. And if like one person believes, well, I think, God made people male and female, that's it. And to me, that excludes any possibility of something else. And I'd say, well, I don't think that. That's not how I interpret the text. I don't know how we get past that. But I do think that, introducing people to the possibility of alternative interpretations of the text can be one thing. I don't think it's going to immediately change somebody's mind, but just to know, hey, there are actually other ways of understanding this. You look at within the Jewish tradition, there are sort of interpretations of this whole creation of humanity as male and female. There are interpretations that understand it really differently. Proposals are like, that the first human was kind of both male and female before being split in half. We can, it's not necessarily the best, most helpful way of thinking about it now, but it just shows that there's a long history of understanding it in different ways. And it doesn't have to be that just this one specific way is the only possible way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one, just generally, we butcher Genesis 1 through 11 in so many different ways that are just horrible to the text in general. But that's kind of my baby, is Genesis 1 through 11. So I don't, when I meet, especially Christian, typical interpreters, I'm like, you probably have one way of thinking about this text. But I like what you said about, even, you know, Eve comes from Adam, and so it's a split. But even in the Jewish mythology, right, they are one and the same. And that's kind of the thing that happens at weddings. Is it's not your two bodies that become one, is that you were one, you were broken, and then you're reconnected. And I've always thought that was a beautiful image of what companionship is. And not to go all Disney and say that there's the one for you and whatever. I think that's a choice we make together. But yeah, I struggle, Max, really, to to have these conversations with our people and just a broader conversation in general, because immediately from once you step into the door, and we've had people in our church that identify, and I always wonder, like, how do you feel here? How do you're wanting to learn about Jesus and you're interested in what we have to say, but then it's kind of like you go sit over there. And like, how do we do a better job of that? How do we make everyone feel welcome, not just trans people, but anyone that might, maybe it's a Black person coming into a white church. I mean, I don't know, white person going into a Black church. You just kind of feel this otherness. And I think the worst thing that we could do is just not talk and share space. And so, how is that going for you, and what challenges are you facing as you kind of go about this research in the midst of a very hostile theological community?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't know, there can be an advantage to being part of the community, which is that the people who aren't going to listen to you are not going to engage at all. Whereas I feel like if you're not, if you're not queer yourself, then people might not realize you sort of have to navigate that moment of, oh, am I going to say something about, if I am affirming of other people in a way that they're not. So sometimes people, self-select out if you're not on board with thinking sort of positively about queer and trans people in theological work. You're probably not going to read or enjoy my work anyway. But that said, I still do encounter challenges. I teach, and I have had students who, they come from a particular perspective that gives them a particular approach towards things like queer people. And I sort of feel like, my job is not to like give them an existential crisis or completely change their mind about everything. My job is to just sort of be like, look, there are other things. I mean, that's kind of my general thing when I teach religion, is just like, I always say, there's one thing I want you to take away from this like world religion class. It's just that every religion is so diverse. And that anytime you say like one thing about, this religion believes or says or whatever, I guarantee you can find somebody who belongs to that religion who will believe and say the complete opposite. So yeah, I think part of it for me is, being willing to approach with a certain degree of grace and patience. I don't think that queer people always have to do that in every circumstance, but certainly if, you're an educator and it is your job to teach these students, then I think you have an obligation to approach them with a certain degree of understanding where they're coming from, and not expecting them to change everything they believe overnight, but just trying to sort of show them alternatives. And I've definitely had, challenging moments in class, but yeah, I think a lot of what I try to do is just like remember that, like, I mean, so this is what I would want people on the other side to do to me, right? Remember that these are human beings, and that's sort of the most important thing.
Yeah, I think sometimes, even in recent conversations, Max, just I think we forget that we are talking to another human embodied person, and there's a two-way formation happening, right? It's lateral, where I'm shaping you, could be hurting you or isolating you, othering you, but I can also be affirming and loving and caring. And same for you. Like, it's a two-way street, and I'm always trying to figure out and discern, one, how do I love this person? How do I help them as a pastor and as a theologian? And that includes people that I disagree with, I think. I think it mostly includes people you disagree with if you take the words of Jesus seriously about, loving your enemies, which I don't see them as anyone as an enemy, but you get what I'm saying. But also just trying to be a good reflection of the image as an ambassador of God, to say, you know what, God made all these people, and he made me, he made you, he made this ecosystem that we live in. So how do I honor that to the best of my ability? And some people don't want to have that conversation at all. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be around me. They don't want to, it's like if we share the same space, we're somehow polluted by each other, which is always strange to me. But that's typically the opinion that I get. And sometimes I don't think we realize how othering it is. And I don't know if I'm sure you have experienced that. We all have. But what advice would you give to the young person, the elderly who maybe feels that way right now, and they feel like there's no hope for them to find their community, or they're struggling through their identity? How would you coach and help them as they're going through those moments?
I think I would say that there is, I guess it's a bit of a cliche, but there are always people out there for you. Like, you can find your people. And even when it seems very hard and scary and confusing, like, those people are out there, and it's just a question of trying to find them. And you can start that wherever you need to start that. And maybe it's just read a book about a certain group of people, or, you know, find an online community. But the possibility is there, and it's really life changing. But it also might not be necessarily in the first places you look or the places that you expect.
Do you have any particular works that have encouraged you or that have been transformative in your own development journey?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an academic, so I will try to not not to recommend too much sort of high theory stuff. But there's a book I read, I think, pretty early on in my academic career. So I think it's just called Transgender by Justin Sabiatanis, and he's a transgender man and a pastor, and a lot of it is just about sort of like how to approach trans people, whether if you are one or trans people, how to approach them sort of from a pastoral and theological and ethical standpoint of just sort of that kind of welcome and kindness and sort of recognition of everybody's struggle, everybody's individuality. I thought it was a very, very powerful text.
What was the book, Max, that came out a couple of years ago that everybody was upset about? And the name is leaving me, but it was basically talking about the dangers of transgender ideology and that and their phrasing. It was called like something about maybe something about the destruction of our daughters or something like that. It had a picture image of a
Oh
girl in
yeah,
front of it.
Irreversible Damage was what the
That's
book was
it. That's
called.
it. Yeah. Yeah. What's
Yeah,
your thoughts on her research? And I'm not trying to be like, just to destroy someone's character or person. I just want somebody from the community to explain how that was received.
yeah. So I think it was approaching it from one very specific angle, and it was specifically the angle of parents who are upset at their child's trans identity and can't accept it. And it was sort of centering that and making that kind of the reality and the truth of everything. And so that was sort of the underlying assumption, is that these parents who were mad that their child was trans were the ones who were in the right and who were correct. And everything else kind of had to be explained. That it was a problem that these young people were identifying as trans, that it's something that had to be explained, that it was coming from, it was coming from outside, that it was some sort of influence. And I think this has become very much a kind of political trope of the moment. This idea that, it's sort of a social contagion, that people aren't really trans. They're just influenced to become that way by those around them, which I think is perhaps an unhelpful way of thinking about things. If it's true in the way that anything is true. Like, we become human beings in relation to other people, but that doesn't mean that other people can brainwash us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought it was a very bad book. Like, I thought it was, as I say, I think, starting from these wrong premises, very ungenerous and unhelpful to the individuals in question. And I think it's also a dangerous book because at the end of it, it actually had a whole like guide to stopping your child from identifying as trans. And it was pretty much a how-to guide for emotionally isolating and abusing your child. So I think it was a very dangerous book. And yeah, I think it should be avoided.
Yeah. I was a little disappointed by the research I found in it because it didn't
There's
actually go to persons that were identifying and getting their experience. Like you said, it was just from the perspective of the parents, which is basically, I'm upset about this, and so let me tell you why it's wrong, which is not a good research approach in general, I would think. But also, like,
Yeah, and there's a
let
book
me
called
ask you something.
Transgender Children and Youth by Elijah Neely, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. But I thought that book was very sort of sensitive and well written and very sort of practical in terms of what do you do if your child comes out as trans. So I would definitely recommend that as an alternative.
Okay, that was my next question, because we've had families that experience this. The child or their child has come out and said, "This is how I identify now. I've changed my name," and it's like both come to you as a leader and are upset about how the other person is responding to the situation. So Max, help us who's not in the community, who don't understand necessarily what's happening in that person's life and experience. How should they respond to their child? And then on the flip side of it, how would you advise the parents to respond to the child?
I'm sorry, you froze up for me for a second. What was the first part of that?
So how do we help the parents respond to the child, and how do we help the child respond to the parent? So both parties are upset at the other person's response. So how do we help them? What advice would you give to them as they're trying to respond?
Yeah, I think it is complicated because I guess I'm not a parent, but I do understand that parents, like, you want what is best for your child. You love your child, but you also have to, at some point, kind of let the child go and become their own person. And that is hard to figure out. It's hard to assess, when to do that and how. But I do think part of it is that sort of taking some time to think about, okay, when am I prepared to acknowledge that my child is their own person and they are going to live their life in ways that I would not necessarily choose for them? And how can I sort of come to terms with that as a parent? And also, how can I prioritize, you know, my child's flourishing? Even again, if it doesn't necessarily look like what I would choose for myself, how can I recognize that they are a person, they are also made in the image of God, and I want to help them with what is best for them? And I think for children, I think a big part of what is necessary as the child of parents is sort of learning that your parents are also human beings.
Mm.
And I think that can be hard to come to, that, at one point they are, they're your sort of providers who give everything to you. When you get sort of a rebellious stage, they're just like impediments who are in the way. And ideally, at some point, you recognize they're human beings and they are flawed like all humans, and they're made in the image of God like all humans. They're doing the best they can with what they have. So I think I would definitely advise sort of patience and forbearance on all sides, attempts to understand each other, and also just trying really hard not to catastrophize and go to the worst case scenario. I think very often people think, this child is coming out as trans. Oh, this means like all the most negative things I could think of. Just take it one thing at a time. And
Mm.
I think that's something I can say both for trans people coming out as trans, whether they're children or adults, and for people around them. It's just one step at a time. Like, what do you need right now? And is it just like being called by a different name? Like, great, you can do that. That doesn't actually hurt anybody. And yeah, just focus on one step at a time. What is in front of you right now? And it can be very, very overwhelming to focus on the whole thing because there is so much involved in transitioning, but just one thing at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, Max. And I hope some parents and kids are able to kind of hear that and find some common ground in our humanity, that we are trying to figure this out together, and we don't want harm, and we don't want destruction and hurt, and we don't want to break the bonds of family. So I think that's, and even outside of trans and queer theory, like it's so hard, even just to, like, expectations of a parent is so difficult. And I've heard it's even worse when you become a parent of older children. So I just try to encourage people to like let the pressure off. You don't have to. There's nothing that, well, there is pressure in society, but as far as you kind of dictate what that is for you, and I think that's really important for self love and care. Just one more question I have for you, Max, and that's related
Yeah,
to.
and I think it's also important. Sorry,
Okay.
can I just add one more thing on that
Yeah,
topic before
absolutely.
we
Hmm.
get to that? Is that okay? Yeah, it's just that we know that among like homeless youth, like a hugely disproportionate number are LGBTQ. And so if a child does come out to their parent as queer, it is likely that they, even if they don't explicitly know, they are taking that risk of becoming one of that statistic. And so it is a real gesture of trust for a child to come out to a parent. And so I think it is very important for the parents to sort of recognize that and be willing to say, yes, like you always have a home with me.
Yeah. Well, we've had those discussions as well. Like it is a real challenge. It's like if you don't abide by my rules, you can't live in my house. So I don't want to make anybody homeless, especially if they're young. Like, and it's something that we can prevent, and all the mental illness that goes along with that, and addiction and hurt. And so, thanks for saying that, Max. But my question for you at the end here is related to disability and tech. If you have any technologies that throughout your research and experiments, whatever, that you've like, this is where we need to go. Like, this is kind of the pathway that we need to take. If you have any specific examples in healthcare or elderly care or mental health, anything and everything that you're like, this is a good example of what we should be developing as tech makers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not an exciting high tech answer, but I really think that the answer is to sort of, think about the social context and, work with what we already have. There are so many ways in which, the things we would look to technology for can be provided. We just need to actually do it. You brought up the example earlier of like robot companions for elder care. I know, what if we made the job of caring for the elderly more desirable? What if it was paid better?
Mm.
It's not a high tech solution, but it is something that would really make a difference. And I think that's something where we can integrate technological things, but we shouldn't use technology as a replacement for, and say, the not very exciting, but very doable work of just improving people's situations.
Yeah, I'm thinking more so of like, Paro, or maybe just like baby dolls and different things, just to have the in between interactions. Because, like you said, it's not a good paying job. There's not a lot of it's really hard on the body and mind. Nobody wants to, as a career path end, to be the person taking care of the elderly. Although that is a very virtuous job and pursuit, and definitely neglected in the West. But that's a good point too. Like, it's got to be a balance between how do we integrate some technologies that make it easier. Like maybe there's a robot that helps pick up the elderly so that nurses aren't hurting their backs as much, but also, so we're taking care of both patient and caregiver. That's what I'm thinking, Max. I'm not necessarily saying like throw grandma to the robots and we'll see you later. But, well, Max, I appreciate you, man. I'm so grateful to get to know you a little bit and our conversation together. And I feel like we talked more about relationships than we did tech, but that's okay. That's more needed in some of these circles. And so I appreciate you. Anything that you want to share about your scholarship, upcoming works, and where people could find you if they have more questions about our conversation?
Particularly, but thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, Max.